21, 1956, East Berlin. It's been raining all night. In the morning, a Soviet signal repair crew heads out to fix a fault on an underground line, routine work, the kind of call that comes in dozens of times a month. But this time, digging along Schönefelder Chaussee, the workers don't hit washed-out soil. They hit a concrete shaft running down and away toward West Berlin. Inside, cables, amplifiers, reels of magnetic tape, and a sign in English. You are now entering the American sector. Within hours, journalists are brought to the site. The KGB turns it into an international scandal. The Americans and the British had been secretly tapping Soviet communication lines right under the garrison's nose. A press conference, furious diplomatic protests, photos of the tunnel splashed across newspapers around the world. On paper, this is the collapse of one of the most expensive CIA operations of the Cold War. In reality, it's a performance the KGB had been rehearsing for almost a year. Because Moscow knew about the tunnel before a single cubic meter of Berlin dirt had been dug. By the mid-1950s, Berlin is an anomaly on the Cold War map. The city sits deep inside the Soviet occupation zone of Germany, but it's split into 4 sectors: American, British, French, and Soviet. There's no wall yet. That won't go up until 1961. People move freely between sectors on foot or by subway. For every intelligence service in the city, that makes Berlin a gold mine. Agents, defectors, surveillance, and most valuable of all, communication cables. The Soviet military headquarters and the KGB's German command post were based in the suburb of Karlshorst, and all their phone and teletype traffic to Moscow and other garrisons ran through underground cable lines. Cracking radio intercepts wasn't always possible. Soviet ciphers were a tough nut to break. But an ordinary phone call over a wire, if you could physically reach it, was easy to listen to. The CIA already had a playbook. A few years earlier, in occupied Vienna, American intelligence and the British had run Operation Silver, digging a tunnel to the Soviet headquarters cables and quietly skimming traffic off them for years without ever being caught. Vienna proved the concept worked. If it worked in a city as small as Vienna, why not do it in Berlin? Bigger, higher stakes, far more valuable intelligence. In December 1953, representatives of the CIA and Britain's MI6 meet in London and approve the plan. Dig a tunnel roughly 450 meters long from West Berlin, under the border, into the Soviet sector, and tap directly into the cable lines running out of Karlshorst. Among the British technical specialists at that meeting is an MI6 officer named George Blake. George Blake wasn't some clerk who happened to be in the room. Dutch by birth, a former resistance fighter in World War II, then a career British intelligence officer. His record looked spotless. The turning point came in Korea, where Blake, serving as MI6's station chief in Seoul, was captured by North Korean forces. Nearly 3 years in a POW camp, American bombing raids overhead, exposure to Marxist writing, and Blake walked out a committed communist. On his own initiative, he offered his services to Soviet intelligence. By the time of the London meeting on the Berlin Tunnel, Blake had already been an active KGB agent inside MI6 for more than 2 years. He sat in on the meeting where they discussed the plan, the cable routing, the tunnel's exit point, and almost immediately handed his Soviet handler, Sergei Kondrashev, a copy of the meeting minutes and a hand-drawn sketch of his own. Where the tunnel would run, which cables it was meant to tap. In other words, the KGB knew about the tunnel before Berlin had even staked out the ground. If stories like this, real declassified case files from the Cold War, are your kind of thing, hit subscribe now. There's a lot more sitting in the Forgotten Files archive, and here's where the story takes its strangest turn. Once they had intelligence on the tunnel, KGB leadership didn't shut the operation down. Blowing the plan immediately would almost certainly point a finger straight at Blake. Only a small circle of people had been briefed on the meeting's details. Instead, Moscow made a call. Let the tunnel be built and go live, and expose it later, by accident, under a plausible cover story to protect the source. Meanwhile, in West Berlin, in the district of Rudow, the Americans build a warehouse under the cover of a military supply depot, but really, it conceals the entrance to a shaft. Starting in September 1954, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers personnel dig a tunnel roughly 450 meters long and just over 2 meters in diameter, about 6 meters deep, through difficult sandy soil, engineered to withstand the weight of 60-ton Soviet tanks rolling overhead. Construction proceeds under total secrecy. Even some of the personnel on site have no idea what the structure is really for. By late February 1955, the tunnel is complete. It takes several more months to handle the most delicate part of the job: splicing into the cables directly beneath a busy road where the lines run less than half a meter below the surface. In May 1955, British engineers successfully tap the lines. And inside the tunnel, hundreds of reel-to-reel tape recorders start running around the clock, capturing Karlshorst's phone and teletype traffic. For almost a year, from May 1955 to April 1956, the operation runs without a hitch. Hundreds of recorders burn through tens of thousands of tape reels, flown out to London and Washington, where hundreds of translators and analysts work around the clock to process the traffic. By the end, the operation will have produced roughly 50,000 tape reels and hundreds of thousands of transcribed conversations. And here's one of the most debated questions in the whole story. How much of it was real? The KGB knew about the wiretap. In theory, they could have simply fed disinformation down those lines. But isolating traffic on those specific cables from the ordinary, routine military correspondence would have risked tipping off the garrison that the leak was known. And that, again, put Blake at risk. So, according to the CIA's own later assessments, a significant share of the intercepted traffic was genuine, unstaged material: supply logistics, troop movements, the everyday paperwork of a garrison. A tunnel the enemy could theoretically have turned into a weapon of disinformation turned out to be, oddly enough, an honest source, because Moscow wasn't willing to sacrifice both the tunnel's cover and their mole for a partial deception operation. By the spring of 1956, Moscow decides the moment has come. They engineer the perfect pretext: heavy rain, a damaged cable, an emergency crew that stumbles onto the tunnel. On April 21st to 22nd, 1956, the tunnel is discovered, and the Soviets play the outrage to the hilt. Journalists brought in, the eavesdropping equipment photographed, the West accused of a flagrant violation of sovereignty. The propaganda payoff is exactly what they were counting on. For American and British intelligence, this looks like a clean defeat. Nearly a year of massive technical and financial effort wiped out by a single TASS statement. But the real cause of the failure wasn't the vigilance of some Soviet line crew. It was a decision made in Moscow a year and a half before anyone picked up a shovel. Blake himself stays above suspicion for another 5 years. His exposure comes from an unexpected direction. In 1961, Polish intelligence officer Michał Goleniewski defects to the West and, among other things, reports a high-level mole inside British intelligence. The list of suspects narrows. Blake is brought in for questioning, and by his own account confesses, somewhat to his own surprise. A London court sentences Blake in 1961 to 42 years in prison, at the time, the longest non-life sentence in British legal history, roughly a year for every Western agent he'd betrayed to the KGB, many of whom were captured or executed. The story doesn't end there. In 1966, Blake escapes from London's Wormwood Scrubs prison, over the wall on a rope ladder, with help from a handful of fellow inmates and activists he'd won over during his time inside. He spends months hiding in London, then is smuggled across the English Channel in a camper van, through East Germany, and on to Moscow. He'll spend more than 50 years there, promoted to KGB colonel, awarded the Order of Lenin, given a state pension and an apartment. He gives dozens of interviews, writes his memoirs, and insists to the end that he never once regretted what he did. He dies in Moscow in December 2020 at age 98, honored with state-level tributes. Operation Gold usually gets told as one of the CIA's most spectacular Cold War failures. A year of construction, millions of dollars, and the whole thing compromised from day one. But there's a real paradox at the center of this story, and it's the reason it's worth telling. Even fully compromised from the start, the operation still produced intelligence that was used for years, simply because Moscow was more afraid of exposing the failure to its own garrison than of losing the tunnel's secrecy. The tunnel was a trap within a trap. Western intelligence thought it was secretly listening to Moscow. Moscow knew and was secretly watching the watchers. And in the end, the real casualties weren't American or Soviet generals. They were the dozens of agents on the ground whose names Blake carried out of the building in his coat pocket. If you want more declassified files pulled straight from the Forgotten Files archive, subscribe. The next case is already unsealed. Next time, another story of double allegiance, this one without tunnels or tape reels. Stay tuned.